I'm gonna start properly. So I'm very pleased to introduce Jevin West. He is an associate professor in the School of Information School at the University of Washington. He is the co-founder of the Data Lab, and he directs the Center for an Informed Public. He studies the science of science and worries about the spread of misinformation. He develops knowledge discovery tools to both study and facilitate science. He has an interest in the origin of scholarly disciplines and how sociological and economic factors drive and slow the evolution of science. I'm happy that he will be giving a presentation now, but he will also be part of a panel later on, and he will be part of the mentoring sessions the later part of today. But now he will be talking about the echoes of science in a pandemic engulfed by an infodemic. So help me in welcoming Professor West to his presentation. Jevin.
Well, thanks, Daniel, and it's good to see familiar faces. Hi, Stephen. Hi, Luis. Hi, everyone that's going to be talking later on today. I'm super excited about this. I wish it was in person, like I think many of us. But what an amazing event. I was thinking, how would my life have been different if I could have been that student sitting in, this kind of school that's being offered around the science of science? What an opportunity for all of you in the crowd right now to get up to speed quickly from people that have been thinking about it and people that still have lots of questions and lots of needs within the fields. This will continue to be an area where we need to invest more in, both at the policy level and at the research level, because we need introspection. We need to be able to look at our institutions and figure out how to create this really amazing innovation machine that we call science. And so it's a real pleasure to be here, and please feel free to jump in and talk anytime. I'm planning to give, I think the plan is, Daniel, about 35, 40 minutes and then questions after that. I can go shorter, longer, whatever you think. But what I wanted to do today was talk to you in sort of hypotheticals, as if you, let's say, were running the National Science Foundation, or you were running one of these policy centers that was trying to try to figure out where science is running well and where maybe it could run better, because we're kind of at what I call kind of a Vannevar Bush moment right now. We're in the midst, or, I wish we were saying we're at the end of a major pandemic where science showed its importance once again for the world. And I think the public, no matter who you talk to, even those that are, let's say, anti-vaccination or still think that maybe the coronavirus is a big conspiracy theory or is a conspiracy, then I still think no matter who you talk to, people will always be citing science. And that's one thing we've found in studying this in the center. I have this background, I'll take it off in just a second. But one of the things that we do in this new center is we think about the issues of misinformation, but specifically for me, misinformation in and about science. And I'm going to talk about the ways in which questions in the science of science could be used to help, sort of figure out what the next version of science is. Back in 1950, I think it was May of 1950, the National Science Foundation was formed through a lot of people's work. It was after another major crisis at the time. It was post-World War II. And Vannevar Bush at that moment was trying to take advantage of that crisis, never sort of let a crisis go to waste, as Churchill and others have said. And that really, and people at the time really believed in science and thought that it was there to help society. And that's essentially, I think, at a moment we're at right now after this pandemic, and with all the changes that are going on in science, from our communication systems, from the ways that we share data, from the ways that we reward science, from the ways that we build teams. These are all the kinds of things that we're doing in science. And so what I'd like to do is go through a couple ways in which we could use questions in science to nudge the institutions and the funding agencies and the policy centers on helping science. So I'm going to share my screen now. So that's kind of what I'm going to try to achieve today. And I'm going to move over. I'm going to make sure that, Daniel, can you see that? If you can just give me a nod You can see
Yes,
my
I can
screen.
see I can see, I think, your presenter view. So I see the notes and everything.
Okay, you probably don't want that then. I'm going to stop sharing that. Lots of notes. I mean, I don't say anything terrible in there, but
Well, it
maybe I
said
have some things that
thank you,
are
Daniel. So
misspelled.
that's good.
There could be, yeah, some things that are wrong there. Now let's try this. Now you can see, right?
Perfect. Perfect.
Okay, so and I will say you'll understand more why I call it echoes of science in a pandemic engulfed by an infodemic throughout, because I'll use the pandemic as a case study for driving some of the questions that I think are relevant, at least some of the relevant questions I'm interested right now. There's lots of interesting questions in the science of science. There's always an interesting paper I'm reading almost every other day in the space. But echoes of science, I'm sort of harking back to some of the discussions that we're having in society more generally around the ways we communicate through social media, where these algorithms and technology more broadly are potentially creating echo chambers and filter bubbles, although that's somewhat controversial all by itself, at least with certain research that have come out. And I'm sort of like saying that maybe science has some of those issues too because of technology, but also because some of its norms and institutions and the way we fund science. And so that's something to sort of think about as we walk through here. So I just want to say a little bit about myself. I actually have spent a lot of time working in real science labs. Sometimes I joke with my colleagues. They say, you know, you're sort of looking at this 30,000 foot level of science, you know, is that real science? I say, absolutely it is. But also I've spent a lot of time, I worked in a physics lab. This is a lab I worked in my postdoc, you know, well over a decade ago. I'm working with physicists and social scientists and biologists. I actually got my training actually in theoretical biology. When I got to my faculty position back in 2013, I co-founded with some colleagues and still kind of co-direct. I say kind of because I'm doing more of this Center for an Informed Public, but we formed the data lab where we did a lot of science of science work, but we also spent time developing data science tools and applied them to all sorts of problems in developmental economics and social network analysis and data visualization, computational social science more generally. And in that time, it helped sort of develop a set of tools that I'm using today in the area of science of science, which is one of my major threads of research still. But right now, over the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time developing a new center. It's called the Center for an Informed Public, which is really meant to address this issue of strategic misinformation. But my role, in addition to directing, is thinking about that interface between science and society. So science of science comes very much into the forefront of a lot of what I do. And, you know, I will say that many of the norms and institutions that emerge in science occurred through happenstance. Like peer review, for example, is a little bit of a happenstance, if you read a little bit about the history of that. And so as scientists in social science, we should be examining this and how the current system and now evolving systems are you know, either facilitating science or hindering its abilities to innovate. And there's been these massive changes in scholarly communication, certainly over the last 20 years. And even just recently in the pandemic, with this rise of the preprints, I mean, preprints have been around for a very long time, but certainly they've become mainstream now in the life sciences and have really changed the way we communicate with the public through science and also within science. And we need to understand the consequences both for how science and society sort of deal with this kind of epistemic crisis that sometimes I even say that word and I almost sounds melodramatic, but sometimes, but in other ways of thinking about it, I think it's very true. So let me give you an example of what I mean of some of the major changes and how that could affect some of the ways in which we think about how science is run and the ways in which we can study it at this larger scale. So open access, people have been familiar with that for a very long time. It's kind of you know, becoming somewhat standard for a lot of work that's done. The products become open access through various different business models or lots of models. You know, author pay charges are one of the more common ones. And as much as I'm an advocate of open access, and I am and always have been an advocate of open access, I mean, our tax dollars that pay for research should be available to us as taxpayers. I think that's one of the main reasons. But there are challenges to that. And one of the challenges is this rise of the predatory journal market. And here's an example of a journal. I actually do this game when I talk to students about this. And I have, you know, hundreds and hundreds of these examples. In fact, I'm writing a little short paper right now that shows sort of how that particular market, the predatory market, is evolving. I asked people, here's a paper. It looks like a science paper. It maybe has a strange title, but here, a mixed method study of telepathic interspecies communication with therapeutic riding horses and their recovering wounded veteran partners. Is this a real journal? That would be my question to you. Is this a predatory journal? Well, certainly if you ask the public, they'd struggle with it because it looks like a real journal, smells like a real journal. It has the sort of visual aspects of a real journal. Or is this a legitimate journal? And so I asked the public we do a whole bunch of these. And a lot of times, they'll do about 50-50 when I do the game, which tells me that they're struggling. But I do this with researchers themselves and scientists, and they also, miss quite a few of these. They do certainly better than the general public, but they also struggle. So, by the way, before I move on, share beware on this one. You should, of course, certainly beware for various reasons. But I will say this is not, by definition. Well, there's different definitions of predatory journals, but I'll just say by sort of some of the standard definitions, this is not a predatory journal. So I hope to surprise you this morning with one that you thought I was going to set up as a predatory journal. This one this journal was listed in ISI. Doesn't have a great impact factor, but was listed and is has legitimate peer review, I suppose. We can still debate whether it's a legitimate title, but the point is, it's not always easy to tell whether things are real or not. And I think that the changing face of scholarly communication is also changing the way that science is done, and that sort of leads to these kinds of questions. But I mentioned before this Vannevar Bush moment, and Vannevar Bush, like I said, was one of the real, originators. There was a lot of people at the time that sort of led to the foundation of the National Science Foundation. It's been over 70 years now, and now we're sort of looking, introspectively at science. And actually, there's new programs at the Science Foundation. There's a Science of Science, essentially directorate for doing this kind of work. And I think leaders at the NSF and other federal agencies that push research are seeing the importance of the work that you're learning about right now. And there's a lot of interest and potential funding coming down the line for doing this kind of work and building off of work that others have done over the last 10 to 20 years. Many of them will be at this summer school. So it's fun for me to see all the names that were coming. But at the time, there was this crisis, just like we're in this crisis right now. Here's a map just this morning of the current risk levels across the United States, given this Delta variant. And the public, this is the public's opportunity to interface with science. The challenge, though, is that most of the public has been engulfed by this what the World Health Organization called in February of 2020 an infodemic, and a lot of that infodemic comes as science that sort of almost sometimes has the veneer of science. Some of it is real science, but sometimes it's not science, and also comes in quantitative form that looks sciencey, comes with graphs and tables and statistics, and it comes with references, sometimes to legitimate journals, sometimes to not, sometimes to preprints that have been taken down, some that have remained and are legitimate science, but that can be confusing for the public. And again, this is my relation to this, but I will mention just briefly that we're doing real-time monitoring now of science-related issues in our center. Our first one, our attempt doing real-time monitoring was in collaboration with Stanford University, where we were monitoring misinformation around the election specifically. Now, that's not science-related, but it did lead to a report where we learned the ways in which science interfaced with the issue even of the election, and also now to a project that we call the Virality Project, where we monitor misinformation around health issues like vaccinations. We're going to continue to build that, but it also has led to a bunch of work looking at the ways in which the way that the public talks about scientific sources and talks about science and talks about, even uses the language of science like statistics and use numbers and graphs. And we've been creating this large typology and data set that's looking at the ways throughout the pandemic that the public has been talking about science through images, videos, tweets, screenshots, et cetera, and the ways in which it's sort of being, where there's misinformation passing about science and within science. And that's probably the one that's even almost most interesting for me, is the within science conversations that are also pushing information that either is refuted at one time or is correct. So here's the point here is that there's a whole bunch of different work that we're working on specifically at this interface of science and society. But imagine again that you're the NSF and you have this moment where the public is paying attention to science as much as it probably has in a very long time, at least from my view of it, studying this. And maybe that has a little bit of a selection bias because I sort of look for these kinds of issues and conversations and all of the data that we collect on this. But imagine you have this moment and you want to sort of use this as a chance to move a very conservative organization like the National Science Foundation or the NIH or others, or science in general for that matter, is a very conservative institution that doesn't like to change too much. And there's good reason for that, but that can also be a detriment if technology and communication is changing so fast, like open access and other forms of communication, but also reward systems and funding mechanisms. And so what can we do? Well, I'll mention two things that I think that the NSF could do, and we could nudge them, or any national organization, not just the National Science Foundation in the United States, but in other organizations or in other countries, sorry. And here's two things that I would say. I would say one of the things that the NSF should be doing is maximizing the return of investment for trusted taxpayers, but also to prepare science for major crisis events. So as someone who works in the science of science, this is an example of many of the ways in which science of science can help prepare prepare society for that next major crisis event. It should be able to create an institution that doesn't sort of come to the party late. So how and what do we do? How do we nudge organizations or just the institution of science? That's not always so easy. And I say nudge, by the way, I use nudge because economists use nudge a lot. And actually we use nudge in a paper we're writing right now, talking about the ways in which you can nudge behavior online to push people to information that is backed by science, or that is legitimately is news that someone could trust about their health. And that's of course a murky subject as well. But how do we nudge? Well, my colleague Carl Bergstrom and I have wrote a book recently about what we call calling BS more generally, and we talk a lot about science. And a lot of times when people think about science, and certainly I did when I was young, is that it's this epistemically pure activity. It's sort of this imaginative, generative process that happens in these cold, dank places where there's just cool inventions and designs everywhere around the wall. But really what I've learned, at least in the 21st century, is that it's very epistemically solid, as we all know. I mean, that we all sort of, we have all the scientists sort of, giving TED Talks and sort of, living within the social media world, and a lot of that's driven by sort of fame and fortune, et cetera. And it's something that, I've been thinking a lot about with Carl and other colleagues about this, and people that work sort of in the science of science. This was sort of driven through conversations that we've had. And it's not a simple system, but I'll try to put it into a few arrows and sort of nodes here, that there are these norms and institutions, and they create incentives. Science is run by scientists. It's not run by bees or ants, although maybe they have incentives too. But scientists respond to incentives, and those incentives then affect what they select in their research studies, and those are then used to interrogate nature to generate knowledge. And this sort of is kind of a new economics of science, which is sort of in the realm of science and science. And then you have this philosophy and sociology of science. Those are sort of the two areas in which I break down my own work in this specific area. But there's also, when you think about this is also opportunities for public policy. This is opportunity for people in education and philosophers that have studied the sociology of science, but also in the area of informatics and computer science that build these tools for developing the ways in which we acquire knowledge. So these are all opportunity areas for the science of science. So now let me work through some of those nudges. So I mentioned sort of this epistemically solid aspect of science that you sort of come to realize as you work in science. It doesn't mean that science is broken or that science is needs to be completely redesigned. It's just that it's run by humans, and humans tend to be like that. We tend to respond to incentives, and giving a TED Talk is one way of doing it. It's nothing wrong with that, but it does sort of change the way that science is done. So what are some of the epistemic blind spots, the type of things that we'll never solve with current norms and institutions? And I think that's one sort of nudge that we should be thinking about when thinking about policy that results from this kind of work. Let me give you an example. So in astronomy, one of the great tools that unleashed a whole, almost, explosion of innovation in the field was the SDSS, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And that allowed for science. It sort of truly, when you hear about democratization, everyone talks about democratization. We certainly did in the early days of the internet. But when you talk about democratization of science, SDSS is actually an example of that. And it's something that you could not have done without that particular tool. But what other kinds of things are limiting our ability to know something about our universe or our society or the natural environment in which we live? And there's been a lot of people that have been thinking about this. I think Kevin Zollman's paper talking about the epistemic benefit of transient diversity is one of many different papers from the philosophy community that's been talking about the importance of epistemic diversity and the ways in which different kinds of norms and institutions sometimes get in that way. And I think as science of sciences, we should be thinking a little bit about those. There's also a great book out called The Knowledge Machine right now that's also by a philosopher at NYU that I think really sort of gets at some of these issues that I think are pretty important within this field, and recommend that. So as we think about this, these epistemic blind spots, we need to be thinking about what those limits are. And I think that's one thing that we can be doing in the science of science. Another big question, of course, is, how often and how long does science settle on falsehoods? What are those falsehoods and how do they get canalized, and what are the downstream effects on science? This is something I'm spending a lot of time on. I'm, of course, thinking about these epistemic blind spots, but what I spend more of my time right now is thinking about these falsehoods, how we settle on them. And when we talk about this, at least when I talk to the public, and even scientists for that matter, a lot of times they'll immediately jump to fraud. They'll say, well, of course, there's lots of fraud. And actually, there are examples of fraud. Actually, one of my favorite examples of fraud is William Shartland's painting of a brimstone butterfly. This was in the early 1700s. And what happened here is he had taken a butterfly and he literally had painted on these little spots. And he sent this in, and he actually fooled Carl Linnaeus in 1763 with this. And they even gave it a new name. They gave it the brimstone butterfly. It wasn't a real butterfly. It was just painted, and they thought they had found a new species of butterfly. And this is an example of fraud. But from my experience reading about this, looking at examples, and even just living in the world of science, myself, I think fraud's it's very rare compared to other forms of canalized falsehoods. Now, of course, the big one, of course, sort of the big story of science when it comes to these issues of falsehoods, and not necessarily, like on purpose falsehoods, not nefarious falsehoods, but falsehoods that can sort of live within the scientific literature a long time, comes, from this story that it's emerged over the last decade or so around the reproducibility crisis. And this is something that the public is certainly very well aware of. And has been paying attention to because it's in the mainstream media a lot, and continues to be talked about this. In fact, it's one thing that we've seen referenced among those that are taking digs at science. They'll often point to that now as well. But even within the science community, this is something that we should be paying attention to. Although I don't think that what we've learned over the last 10 years around the reproducibility crisis means that science is broken. Again, I'll reiterate that. I still think science works quite well, but it is something where we need to pay attention, and people are paying attention to. Actually, I'll skip this because I'm realizing I'm getting a little behind. I'm going to skip a few as we go through here because we are getting a little, I'm realizing I need to try to finish in time so we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. But let me just note one of the many studies, big reproducibility studies, multi-million-dollar reproducibility studies in these various fields. This one is in psychology. They took the 100, one of the more well-known 100 studies in psychology, and they replicated them. And before I show you the result, if you haven't read this paper, what do you think, how many do you think they replicated out of the 100? Well, 39 out of 100. And the interesting thing about that result is you could make an argument for why this is a good result, and you could also make an argument for why this is a bad result. Of course, to a person that might not be familiar, actually, even from a lot of scientists' perspective, they might look at that and that's terrible. These are some of the most well-known these are 100 well-known studies in psychology. Only 39 were replicated. That's not something to brag about in science, and something we should be worried about. You can make that argument, but you could also make the argument that 39 out of 100 is actually quite good, given all the variables and all the things that need to be taken into account when you make these replications, et cetera. So maybe this is a good number. The point is, again, it is something that we need to be paying attention to if we care about the canalization of falsehoods in science and trying to reduce that within the scientific literature. Now, it's interesting, by the way, this is sort of, I always kind of like the battle between economists and psychologists. Like the economists have replicated as well and haven't done that much better. But what's interesting is they don't just report their results like many of the other fields. The economists, of course, compare themselves to the psychologists. That's what they do. So they don't just report their results of how well they do. They make sure they compare to their psychology friends and they say, aha, look at this. We do much better than psychologists. Well, that you can argue whether it's much better or not, but there's all sorts of other issues other than or that live within this reproducibility realm, which I talk about it in my classes, and when we talk to the public about it and scientists, there's issues of p-hacking and outcome switching and harking and uncorrected multiple comparison. These are all issues that we have to deal with, but one of the more salient ones is just simply this file drawer effect, that you have these positive results. Those are the ones that get published by these arbitrary sort of statistical boundaries that we put on whether someone should be published or not. So here, one arbitrary boundary would be the p.015. Actually, just talking about p-values all by themselves is something that could be an entire lecture. And then the negative results, of course, get thrown into the file drawer. But the question is not so much, how many negative results go unpublished, which is the question that people want to know, because we do have some of that actually from the scientometric and bibliometric literature. There's been some results that have looked at that, and you can measure the fraction of published results that are negative. And it turns out it's around, at least according to some of these studies, about 15% around the sciences, 5% in social psychology, it's kind of a lower bound, but that's not necessarily what we want to know. What we want to know is the fraction of negative results that are published, and that's difficult to do. And a lot of times people will put sort of look to register reports with public, register reports as a way to help the publication bias issue. And I'm a fan of this. I think it's a great way to be thinking about it for some forms of science. I definitely don't think it's a panacea. There's been great work out there that has shown why that's not, pre-registered reports isn't just the answer. It's, it should be part of the conversation, but it's not a panacea. And the idea here is you design experiments, design the analysis, pre-register study. A lot of you have seen that, so I'm not going to go into that. And pre-registration essentially locks down the analysis here. That's kind of what we're sort of referring to. And you review before the results are known, and this and that reduces publication bias. So the question to me, and by the way, I just will say, when looking at this, there's been some great work like Eric Turner and others that have looked at sort of spurred a lot of this work, looking at least studies that came into the FDA that had to report whether that was positive or negative. And that's when it was revealed. And so I bring that example up because I think that's a great example of the kinds of things that we can be doing in the science of science. But I want to go to the question that almost spurs a lot of this, almost this whole talk that I wanted to mention today, is that could we as researchers in the science of science, but also researchers in science more generally, could we have predicted the reproducibility crisis? That's a question that kind of bangs around in my head a lot. If the science of science is actually working well and it's developing models, it's collecting data, it's doing good empirical work to try to understand what's going on in our with our teams and our institutions, and even just within the culture of science, Could we have sort of predicted something like that? We at least need research communities that can detect this type of crisis and understand what's driving it and respond in ways that are grounded both theoretically and empirically. So when I think about the science of science, it's really about not just sort of tracking what's going on, but also being able to do some predictive work, like something like reproducibility crisis. Now, it's a hard thing to ask of it, but maybe it's a challenge that we have within the science of science. Okay, so now let me move to another nudge. How do we, this is something that if you were the NSF or another funding agency or policy agency, how you're in charge of allocating, $8 billion if you're the NSF, and actually no more now that it's being increased. How do you allocate funding in order to maximize return of investment and also improve efficiencies and increase real productivity? I think there's a lot of great work actually by my colleague Carl and also Kevin Gross at South Carolina State and various other places that have started to look deeply at contest models and different ways and the inefficiencies. There's a whole bunch of work that's going on in this area. And it's not my area, but it's an area I try to track, keep on top of, because I think it actually provides a lot of great work. There's actually people in this crowd, I think, that will be here that have been looking at, early career setbacks and future career impacts. I think these are the kinds of things that we can be looking at when thinking about efficiencies, both in terms of team dynamics and the work that's being done. And I also, one recent paper, a paper that my student and I recently just finished, is looking at the hidden influence of communities and collaborative funding for specifically clinical science. And we relate to a lot of the work around COVID-19 clinical work. And so in this work, we're sort of looking at the ways in which some of these systems are both inefficient and also inefficient. And sort of an open area that I've been starting to explore and sort of as another nudge, if you were that NSF, because remember, you're sitting in that chair right now as the NSF director. What can we do to nudge science in ways? And it's this nudging that can be done by the science of science. So, okay, nudge number 4, I'm moving through the nudges and I'm going to try to sort of wrap up in the next, I would say 4 to 5 minutes. So, what are the consequences of science of 20 plus years of metric development? There's going to be more metrics. There have been metrics for a long time, and it's something that I'm concerned about. And certainly the NSF, you're looking to metrics. You have to have, it's not, it would be silly not to use any metrics, but it would also be silly to only rely on metrics. And we know that. And we've been sort of doing this for a long time. Here's one of the original CDs that I extracted my first bibliometric data long time ago, but it used to be living in these large citation index books. I was looking at the ways in which journals were evaluated and how journals were connected in the overall science system. And I had to extract this from a DVD. Actually, it was even more old than that. And it sort of led to a bunch of work that my colleagues and I did around developing different algorithms and metrics. And during that time, I began to realize and also lift different ways during my postdoc, develop different kinds of methods for mapping the sort of change, or these networks over time. But over this time of working on metrics, it wasn't that it was bad. Actually, there's reason to develop metrics that at least do a better job of whatever you're trying to achieve. And you can also use those metrics, by the way, for recommender systems, which we've done, and visualization systems for sort of tracking this kind of information. So there's things on the engineering side that you can use these metrics for as well, not just for evaluating sort of the influence of an individual in the scientific literature. But the problem is that it always kept coming back to me, and it's not that I even still sort of think about metrics. It's I talk to a lot of economists, and they're always thinking about metrics too. But Campbell's law from '79 really always comes back to me, and that's just the more that any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social process it is intended to monitor. And sort of relates also to, in an earlier version in Goodhart's law, was that any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed on it. And so, by the way, a TLDO version is just when a measure becomes a target, ceases to be a good measure. And my colleagues and I, we talked a lot about this a long time ago, and it still needs to, not a long time ago, but giving bad answers, really, in my opinion, is not the worst thing in a ranking system. It's the worst. The worst thing is to encourage bad science. And so we see that actually many countries used to and still do actually give bonuses for publishing in certain kinds of journals. Actually, China at some point used to give like $60,000 bonus. I don't know the exact number. I have to go back and look. They actually, for the first time during the pandemic, China removed that reward system because of the perverse incentives that it was creating, because of the ways this incentive system was set up and these metrics that were on, that were flawed themselves, that was sort of pushing science in the wrong direction. It wasn't encouraging the kind of science that we want to get done. And during the pandemic, some of those rewards were taken out, which was interesting to see. But the point is, again, here is that the nudge and the metric on top, or what I'm talking about here, are the metrics and the reward systems that we need to pay attention to make sure that they don't push us in directions that don't achieve the goals of science that we want achieved. All right, so last couple of nudges. One of the big things I spend a lot of time on, and probably the thing I'm spending the most within the center right now, in addition to that second nudge, is what's the impact of digitization, search engines, social media, and recommender systems on science? Is it narrowing or is it expanding our collective view of the literature? A lot of our early searches were sort of walking through the library. I remember that. Yeah, it's certainly, I'm old enough to remember going to the library to get journals, to pick out books. I still go get books, but journals, we do it at our computer. Now this is sort of academic search 2.0 with Google Scholar sort of, and other search engines sort of being our portal into the literature. So the question for me, are these portals, facilitating, let's say, call it an effective collective reading of the literature, or is it creating a narrowing on literature that's limiting our ability to see the full literature because it's sort of giving you the same results, and then this click behavior and user behavior then sort of facilitates the rich get richer sort of processes that we expect to see happening, and we do see happening in all sorts of work that's come out of information retrieval literature. And so we're going to look at sort of, and part of this is driven also by this dual role that search and evaluation plays. So the big thing here is that technology amplifies these social cues, and this rich get richer effect has been known for a very long time. And there have been those also. James is going to be talking later today, I think, or tomorrow, definitely at the school. I know he's here. In Science wrote this very nice article about, the electronic publication and narrowing of science and scholarship, and certainly influenced some of the work that we've done recently in further investigating this after now, being in 2021, asking this question after a longer time period to see whether it's narrowing or expanding. And actually what's interesting is, even in the field of science and science, there's some nice debates going on. We're all very nice in the science of science, but we should also be debating and questioning each other's results a little bit. And that's happening. Vincent Laviere actually questions James' results and his colleagues, of course, not just Vince Vincent, but others in the field. And he said, actually, I'm seeing a different result, and had an argument why there's not a decline. The decline in concentration of citations is what he found, whereas James found sort of the opposite result. And he was very strong in his response. There's practically irrefutable evidence. I enjoy these sort of strong worded responses here. The main thing is, I don't have a lot of time to go in detail, but I'm happy to if there's questions about this. But essentially, James was seeing sort of a more concentrated version of the citation distributions, whereas Vincent was seeing sort of a more flat line. The very different results for the same kind of question. And so there's battle going on between these two. And so my colleagues and I wanted to look into this specifically because we were interested in the ways that technology was affecting scientific discourse. And we had a longer time period, and we wanted to see what was going on. So as we started to look into this, we recently published a paper that developed a framework for actually asking this question. Because what we found in looking into this question is that I think both of them had a little bit of problems with the way that they may have been looking at it. And you can read the paper to see our way of addressing it, that we're essentially a biasness in the inequality measures that are used. So the inequality measures for looking at the citation distribution skewness values, that typically you use Gini coefficients, all sorts of different kinds of metrics from economics, et cetera, that are published in actually thousands of papers. And what we found during that time is that if you ever look at inequality of distributions like citation distributions, you need to be very careful, because there's this intrinsic bias that we sort of argue exists in there, and you need to make these corrections. So we wrote this paper, we with Chris Adolph, a colleague, and Kate Stovall here, and Lanu Kim, who's now just starting her faculty position. And we used a whole bunch of data. I sort of won't go into all the details of this. Oops, sorry. And the main take home is that when we looked at this across these different fields and we corrected for this bias, at least when looking at citations within fields, we found that that there wasn't a lot of change in the distributions. But we did see, however, when we looked at citations across fields, when you're sort of looking at a field you're not as familiar with and using, let's say, Google Scholar to find the references to sort of justify your argument in a field you aren't as familiar with, sometimes we do see in some fields more skewness. But the big take home I want to say here is that anyone that uses inequality measures and inequality metrics from economics and social sciences, I would recommend reading this particular paper. It was new. It was a big reveal for us in doing the work, and we weren't intending to identify that. We were just asking the same questions of whether science was narrowing or sort of expanding in its collective view. And in doing so, we found what was a pretty important finding, I think, in my own opinion, just because I've been using inequality measures and have misused them based on this particular result. So you can go in and look at more. These are just other fields and how we did this adjustment, but I will go into that in more detail if you have a question. The main thing here is that the bulk of the apparent decline in citation quality is an artifact of what we call marginal bias. It's our own term, but it's a form of bias. And the same results holds for cross-disciplinary comparisons to some degree, but sort of does change if you look at citations across those boundaries. So the main point here is be careful when using inequality measures a lot. We do that a lot in the science of science, and especially when we deal with distributions with lots of zeros. Okay, last thing, and then I'm going to summarize, sort of finish up here. One of the things that we look at too, or what are the long terms of open science, informatics-driven science, sort of the preprint adoption of science, and how should we adjust norms and institutions? There's a lot of interesting conversations around data parasites that are going on. I think we in the science of science want to make sure that we're sharing and actually rewarding work that's actually facilitating the creation of data sets that are used by others. And I can give an example of one of the students that I worked with, and he recently graduated, on the sharing of his code and data and the importance in the pandemic of that particular work, but it's also super important within the science of science. We depend on these data sets. And I feel very sad to see that the Microsoft Academic Graph is now turning its lights off in December. So if anyone wants to take that baton, please do, because it's such an important data set. But a lot of this work that I've talked about just today, but also specifically around the effect of informatics and data, was a recent paper that Carl and I wrote in PNAS talking about misinformation in and about science. And we refer to a lot of the science of science work. And a lot of that, one of the issues of many that we discuss in this is about the ways in which the preprint archive is changing how we're thinking about science. And I'll give you an example of a paper that was shared early on in the pandemic that is now one of the most shared articles in science of all time. If you look at its altmetric scores, it's in the top 0.001%. This is an article that was retracted. So one of the most shared articles within the public sphere is an article that's been retracted. And actually, if you go there, it's this one's red, at least. Some of these most of them aren't even red boxes. But the point here is that we have to be careful. I'm a huge advocate of preprint, but this transition is really affecting. It's one of the things we're finding tons of misinformation passing because of this adoption, so quick adoption with the public not being aware of it. But it's not just preprints. There's equally dreadful peer-reviewed work that's going on in science when it's really sped up to a fast degree, like it has been in the pandemic. And there's even viral articles, science articles, supposedly, that don't even have preprints associated with them. This one was an article that was talked about all over my local news and across the world about a viral study about runners spreading coronavirus. It wasn't even a study, it was just a simulation. So these are the things that we're looking at. We're also, we published an article about the ways, what is the effect of technology on what we read, cite, and reward. We published a paper recently looking at the ways in which both, sort of the preprint archives are sort of changing the role of journals. The big take home for us, at least in this article, was that journals still matter. And that's, I'll leave it at that because I want to summarize here. So, all right. So the last thing I want to say is that there are all sorts of ways of sort of looking internally as a science of science community and as science in general. But one of the most important things I'm always sort of looking to is something that Neil Postman talked about in the 1960s. He was a sociologist, and he talked about his third law, essentially a bullshit. It's what I consider bullshit studies at the time. And at any given time, the chief sort of bullshit which we have to contend is ourselves. And so we need to be reflective in science. We need to be looking at our norms and institutions. We need to be making sure that we're continually sort of monitoring this system that's solving a lot of society's most pressing problems. So in summary, I just want to say these are the sort of nudges I talked about. These are some of the kinds of things that I think about when I think about science of science. And really, I'll sort of end with a bonus that I didn't really get into. It's how do we build a robustness against disinformation, since that's something I'm thinking a lot about, agnotogenicis and malicious attacks on science, both externally and internally. And I actually use a lot of studies and work from the science of science to talk about and to think about this particular issue. So with that, I didn't get to one of the nudges, which is organization and communication structures that facilitate diverse teams, and some of the work that we've done around looking at gender. But we'll just leave that maybe for an open discussion throughout the rest of the discussions today and the rest of the week. So with that, I'll end, and sorry for going over a few minutes, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jerry. And that was really amazing. Lots of virtual applause here on Zoom. You know how difficult it is to appreciate that. Lots of discussions in the chat. So if there are questions, please raise your hand, and I can choose whoever has questions. Okay, so we have Hannah with a question.
Hi, this was great. Thank you. I'm curious if you view the perception of unreliable science by the public as a more difficult problem to solve than our recognition of the reproducibility crisis internally. Like, is addressing reproducibility issues harder, or conveying the robustness of the scientific process more difficult?
That's a great question, Hannah. I'm glad you asked it, because I can answer this one really quickly, but then I don't have a very good follow-up because I don't have a good answer. I absolutely think that the perception of science is harder. I think that we're developing new kinds of processes and mechanisms and ways in which we communicate to deal with this reproducibility crisis.
I mean, sorry, but we don't see your video. Sorry.
Oh, my video. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Your camera.
What happened to my video? Let me turn it off and then turn it back on here. Let's see. It's just, it sort of died after I put, I'm so sorry. Like, it just died here. Here, I'll keep answering while I try to figure out. Maybe I'll put it on my other one. Let's see if this works. Do you see me now? No, it just died. I don't know. I'll just have to be that blank screen for a second. Sorry, Hannah. So I'll just say that I definitely think the sort of addressing the perception is way harder, because with the reproducibility crisis, even despite these things that we have found, there's reasons to I mean, I can argue that I think science still works pretty darn well. There was this seismic paper that was published by Unitas, you know, a long time ago, by why much of the literature is false. And, you know, it was a very provocative paper that sort of spurred a lot of the conversation. But there were some things that that a lot of the public and even people in the science world don't pay attention to when they read that paper. And one of them was this assumption that all hypotheses are equal. And that's just not the case in science. There's a bunch of other reasons why, like, you know, the file drawer effect and the reproducibility crisis itself is still, even despite all that, is producing good results. Like, if it wasn't, then things like, you know, CRISPR technology, for example, or mRNAs would just fall apart because, you know, all this other technology relies on that. And we also don't just go after hypotheses that are just sort of random, you know, questions that we find in the knowledge sphere. We go after things that we think are working. There's a whole bunch of other reasons I could go into reasons, but the perception of science and how science works and the robustness of science, that self-correcting nature, having, you know, conveying that to the public is a much bigger challenge. And the part that I don't have an answer for, I mean, I have, you know, I can speculate on answers, but trying to figure out how to address that is, I think, one of our big challenges, because we can do great science, but if we don't have public support for it, they're the ones paying for the bulk of science. And I think we have to address that. And I think a lot of scholars and researchers, and you, the next generation of researchers in the science of science, I think hopefully will be willing to take up that role a little bit, to speak about science, to think about it, because you're thinking about it from a very at different scales. And I think that gives you an opportunity to talk to the public, to talk to policymakers and funders and the private industry and the media. So I think that's what we need to do. And I think one of the things that we can do is we can talk about the successes, and we can talk about the ways that science has sort of overcome some of its sort of non-successes. I think the pandemic is a great learning moment right now. And actually, I use it all the time to talk about what we know and what we don't know and how we sort of deal with uncertainty and stuff. But anyway, a quick answer again to the question is just that, yes, I think the perceptions is way harder.
Thank you.
Ali, go ahead.
Hi, Jevin. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, I can. Sorry that you can't see me. I don't know why.
No, it's all right. So no, it happens to me that Zoom crashes, so I'm used to that. Thanks for an exciting talk. I have a question that I hope I will not get a straight no for it. But the thing is about literature. So I am looking for, and I have a bunch of like them gathered already in a Zotero collection on studies that at least in a like a agent-based modeling or simulation way go over the policy level, so micro level, those who put policies, and then community level, that is where the unwritten rules are sitting. That, for example, I need to do peer review while at the same time I need to publish not to perish. And then individual scientist level, that's these micro decisions that they make. Have you seen any of the literature that you can point at that I can read and see of models that take these three different levels into account that you are talking about, but unfortunately they go unnoticed most of the time? Because as you said, scientists are playing by the rules set by others, and they are prone to be incentivized. So thanks.
Yes, it's a great question. And I would love to see more theoretical work being done, paired well, of course, with empirics. And the first thing that comes to my mind is there was a workshop, I think 2 or 3 years ago, that Katty Borner at Indiana University put on at the National Science Foundation. And it was a workshop specifically around simulation. I don't think anyone, if I remember a lot of those papers and some of those presentations, I don't remember anyone integrating those three levels as you mentioned, Ali, but you could at least look at that workshop, and I can dig a little bit more and see if I can find it. But I'm not aware, and maybe someone else in the audience right now is aware of work that has specifically integrated those three levels. I mean, it would be a very difficult task, just because modeling is difficult by itself. So, I commend you for doing that work, but it's something we do need to be doing. We need to be creating models, doing some theory, doing some simulation as a way of provoking different questions and things that we should be collecting and looking for in the empirical world. And I'm seeing a little bit more of it. And I think part of it, like this workshop I'm mentioning that Katty had put together, I think was an example, was a chance to talk about the work that was being done, but also to excite others. And I think there might have been an opportunity. So it's just search for it. If you can't, I can try to dig up something, but I can't think of anything right offhand that integrates all three. Oh, Daniel, I can't.
Sorry, we have a question from Rodri.
Hi, can you hear me? Is that fine?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Hey, great. Thanks very much for the talk. I thought it was excellent. Really, really kind of exciting. I just kind of have maybe a little niche question, which is whether you know of any studies or whether you've looked at it yourself about the people gaming preprint servers. I've just come across a few examples recently of odd short letters packed with a few citations. And it looks as though people are putting up preprints to inflate their Google Scholar citations. And I just wondered if you knew of any kind of other examples of this.
Oh, I think it's a great observation, and something we've done a little bit of work. Actually, we call it the sort of SEO of academics. these people sort of gaming the system. I will say that there are lots of examples, at least I sort of haven't personally, but also it's been written about, of people gaming journal metrics. So, you'll see citation cartels, you'll see editors sort of, forcing authors to include, X number of citations from their own journal, or share. The cartels are sort of, journal editors, sort of playing the game and sort of sharing with each other. You see those, of course, in the H-index. There's been these kind of spoof experiments where individuals will show how easy it is to game H-index, at least on Google Scholar, because Google Scholar is an automated system that's just sort of gobbling it up, and you can create entire CVs and then just cite. And, I can't remember the individual that did this, but showed how easy it was to like double his H-index or whatever it was. I can't remember the amount, but here's the thing. It comes back to something that, I was talking just earlier in the talk, that science is run by humans with strong incentives to have high H-indexes and to get funding and to have papers published. And so I absolutely think it's happening. And if you can come up with other examples, I think it'd be very illustrative of either the impact of that kind of behavior on scientific reward systems, promotion, hiring, funding, things like that. I think it's important. I absolutely think it's happening. I'm just wondering, what is it being, what could we do to address it? So having some example, what could we do? One of the things is that you could identify how they're getting amplified. It could be algorithmically, it could be certain search engines that are more prone to that. There's all sorts of things that you could look into, but I'd be happy to talk about it more and some of the things that we're looking at, and share some of our data that we've collected on, again, this kind of SEO issue. And but really a lot of it for me, the impetus was just looking at these nice examples that others had done, finding when people had manipulated those. And here's another thing. We've looked at like self-citations. And I want to say this, like from the very, I've written a couple of papers on self-citations. I want to be careful not to sort of make self-citations out to be a bad thing, because most of the time people are self-citing for good reason. And if it's a small field, that might be the only thing they're citing. But there is egregious things like self-citations. There's also, plenty of examples that journals themselves are doing this. So I guess when doing that, if you do this work, one recommendation is to be careful not to impute intentions if you aren't quite sure, though. I would report it and say, here's what I found, and you can decide whether it's manipulative behavior. But I would just be very careful if you go this route. And again, I'm happy to talk about this in more depth if you want. We can jump on a call. But just be careful, because intentions and behavior is sometimes easy to measure, but intentions aren't. And so that's something to keep in mind. But I've learned my lesson on that.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Yeah, I did a little bit on citation bias, and I learned my lesson.
Okay, yeah, you've been through this then for sure.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I'll definitely get in contact.
And if you had my video on, you could see my big smile that I'm sure you had on this. And one thing I was going to say, Daniel, is I could jump out and jump back in, but I think that would just take more time. So I'll just keep going with dark mode.
Yeah, that's fine. I think this is the perfect time to finish your talk, Jim. And I know that you will join back again for the panel, and you will have one-on-one meetings with some of the students. So thank you so much for your presentation. Really, really interesting as always. So thank you. And
and thank you, everyone. And if I didn't get to questions, let's talk in other sessions. I love this school, and I want to thank you, Daniel, for putting this together in front of everyone, just because what an amazing, it's the first time I've ever seen this, a science of science school. Great program. And I'm happy to chat more this week and also anytime after that, of course. So thanks, everyone. Yeah. And I will have my camera working for the panel.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Stephen, too, for helping me move this forward, my students. So yeah, as Jevin said, like when I started, I didn't know anything at this. I wish we had something like this. So this is great.